December 24th, 1945, Camp McCain, Mississippi. The air smelled of damp canvas and Mississippi pine, but inside Barrack No. 9, it only smelled of stale fear and unwashed bodies. Annie clutched the younger girl, Elsa, whose thin shoulders shook under the rough wool blanket. Elsa stared at the American corporal by the door, his rifle slung low. He wasn't looking at them. He was looking at the crude wooden table, where a small tinfoil star sat next to a half-eaten K-ration biscuit. Annie pressed Elsa's face into her coat. "Es ist gut, Elsa. See," she whispered, pointing. The corporal wasn't menacing them. He was awkwardly placing 3 small, wrapped bars of fragrant soap on the table. A posted rule nailed to the gate. Compound C, non-fraternization, was visible through the frosted window, but the guard just nodded, his gaze averted. The silence was the loudest sound. It is powerful to see humanity cross divides. Share in the comments which country you are watching from. 6 weeks earlier, Fort Getty, Rhode Island. The truck stopped, but the vibration continued. It was a deep shaking inside Annie's bones that had nothing to do with the vehicle's engine. For 3 days, they had been moved like cargo, first from the ship, then onto a train, and now this canvas-covered truck. "Rouse!" a voice barked. The canvas flap was thrown back, flooding the truck bed with blinding cold light. It was early 1945 at Fort Getty, Rhode Island. The air smelled of salt and diesel. Annie grabbed the hand of the girl next to her, Elsa, only 17, a helper from the field hospital. "Come, Elsa, langsam." "Come, Elsa," slowly. They stumbled out, their legs stiff. A perimeter of American soldiers watched them, their faces grim, rifles held ready. There were 24 of them, women, nurses, signal operators, administrative staff. Now, just prisoners. Annie's primary sensation was the filth. It was a thick, gritty coating that made her uniform stiff and turned her hair into a solid, painful mass against her scalp. The dust of her homeland had been replaced by the dust of the Atlantic crossing, and now, the dust of America. She tried to pull a strand of hair away from her eye, but it was caked with grime. It felt less like hair and more like rope. "Line up, 5 deep." The English words were harsh, incomprehensible sounds. A guard shoved one of the older women, Frau Keller, who stumbled. Annie moved to help her, but Elsa whimpered, pulling her back. Annie held the girl steady, shielding her. "We are okay," she whispered, more to herself than to Elsa. They were marched toward a long, black-tarred barrack. Annie kept her eyes down, focusing on the gravel path, counting her steps. She remembered the propaganda films, the cruel, decadent American. She expected punishment. She expected humiliation. A soldier walked down the line, tossing something at their feet. It was bread, not a loaf but a single dry heel. It landed in the dirt near Annie's boot. He did not handle it to them. He threw it, the way one throws scraps to a dog. Frau Keller, desperate, bent to retrieve it, brushing off the gravel. Annie felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. They see us as animals. The bread was sustenance, but the act of receiving it was a stripping away of dignity. The humiliation was worse than the hunger. She looked at the guard. He was young, chewing gum, his eyes bored. They were processed in a cold hall. Names, numbers, a quick, rough medical check where a male doctor looked at their throats without ever meeting their eyes. They were given thin blankets and a single, coarse bar of brown lye soap, the kind used for scrubbing floors. That night, in the dark, cold barrack, Annie listened to Elsa's quiet sobbing. Annie touched her own hair. The lye soap was too harsh. It would burn their skin. It was useless for the caked dirt and oil in their hair. She felt trapped beneath the filth, unrecognizable even to herself. The war was over for them, But this new degradation had just begun. The journey south was a blur of suffocating heat. Rhode Island had been cold and damp, but Mississippi was a furnace. The humidity clung to them, making their filthy clothes a second sodden skin. When they arrived at Camp McCain, the air was thick with the smell of pine, damp earth, and something metallic, like rust. Camp McCain was larger, more permanent, and more organized than the holding facility. The prisoners were marched to Compound C, a section fenced off not only from the outside world, but also from the male prisoners they sometimes heard singing in the distance. Their new supervisor was a stern-faced woman in an American WWII uniform, perhaps in her 40s. She stood before them, hands clasped behind her back, and addressed them in perfect clipped German. It was shocking to hear their own language used with such cold authority. "I am Sergeant Hoffman," she said, her eyes sweeping over them, lingering on their matted hair and dirt-streaked faces with visible distaste. "You are not soldiers. You are Kriegsgefangene. You will obey the rules of this camp, which operate under the Articles of the Geneva Convention." She pointed to a large wooden sign nailed to a post. "Rule 1. Absolute obedience to all guards. Rule 2. You will remain in your designated compound. Rule 3. Non-fraternization. Any attempt to communicate with, signal to, or fraternize with American personnel, other than in the line of official duty, is forbidden." Elsa shifted beside Annie, intimidated by the woman's severity. Annie kept her gaze steady. "You will work," Sergeant Hoffman continued. "Laundry, kitchens, mending, work rosters will be posted. You will maintain strict hygiene. This is America, not—" She paused, then continued. "This is America. We do not tolerate filth." The irony was a physical blow. Annie looked down at her own hands, the nails broken and black with grime. She felt the constant, maddening itch in her scalp, a crawl of dirt and sweat that had become a part of her. "You do not tolerate filth," Annie thought, "but you deny us the means to be clean." Later, they were issued their bedding and new work clothing, simple, coarse cotton dresses dyed a dull brown. They were also given their hygiene allotment. Annie watched as a trustee slid a bar of soap onto her metal tray. It was the same dark brown, harsh lye soap from Fort Getty. It smelled acrid, like chemicals, and rendered fat. In the wash house, Annie tried to use it. She pumped cold water into a basin and worked the lye soap against her skin. It was abrasive, stripping the oils from her hands but doing nothing to the embedded grime. She looked at her hair in a small, cracked mirror. It was hopeless. Using this soap on her hair would be like washing it with acid. It would burn her scalp and turn the strands to brittle straw. She gave the soap to Elsa, who was trying to scrub her own uniform in a bucket. The girl's hands were already red and raw. Annie saw the lye soap for what it was, not a tool for cleanliness, but a tool for labor. It was meant for floors and soiled linens, not for people. That night, listening to the unfamiliar chorus of Mississippi insects, Annie realized the rules were not the true prison. The true prison was this layer of filth, a constant physical reminder that they were less than human. Sunday was different. The clanging bell that woke them for work rosters was silent. They were permitted 2 hours of personal time in the morning, provided they remained inside Compound C. For the older women, this meant prayer. Annie, Elsa, and Frau Keller gathered in a corner of the barrack, near a window where the weak Mississippi sun cut a dusty rectangle onto the floorboards. There was no pastor, no organ, no incense. There was only the shared memory of ritual. Frau Keller, whose husband and sons were all missing on the Eastern Front, led them. She recited the Lord's Prayer in a low, trembling voice. Annie closed her eyes, trying to transport herself back to the small stone church in her village. She tried to feel the polished oak of the pew beneath her hands, to smell the beeswax candles. But the sensory memory failed. The only smell was the pervasive odor of unwashed bodies, stale sweat, and the acrid tang of the lye soap clinging to their rough cotton dresses. The only sensation was the persistent, dull itch in her scalp. It felt like a profanity, this filth. How could one feel clean before God when one was so physically soiled? "Lasst uns singen," Frau Keller whispered. "Let us sing." She began, "Ein feste Burg ist unser Gott." A mighty fortress is our God. Her voice was thin, but it held a core of surprising strength. One by one, the other women joined. Elsa's soprano was shaky, but she followed Annie's lead. It was a song of defiance, of faith in the face of destruction. As their voices swelled, rising above the sounds of the camp, Annie felt a strange calm settle over her. The music itself was a form of cleansing. It was something the guards could not touch. A shadow fell across the doorway. A young American guard, Corporal Davis, stood there. He was the one Annie had seen chewing gum in Rhode Island, the one with the bored eyes. He leaned against the doorframe, his rifle slung casually over his shoulder. The singing faltered. Elsa fell silent, her eyes wide with fear. The rule, non-fraternization, felt absolute. Was singing a form of communication? Corporal Davis did not move. He did not raise his weapon. He did not tell them to stop. He simply listened, his head tilted slightly. His expression was unreadable. It was not kindness, but it was not hostility either. It was neutrality. He was watching them as specimens, perhaps, or simply passing the time on a boring Sunday watch. Annie held his gaze. She took a breath and continued the hymn, her voice clearer now. She would not be silenced in her prayers. She sang the final verse, looking directly at him. For a long moment after the hymn ended, there was only silence. Corporal Davis pushed himself off the doorframe. He nodded once, a curt, almost imperceptible gesture, and walked away. A collective sigh of relief filled the barrack. It was a small victory, a moment where their humanity had been asserted and acknowledged, even if only by a neutral gaze. Elsa even managed a weak smile. "He didn't yell." "No," Annie said, smoothing the girl's tangled hair. The brief peace felt fragile, but real. The moment shattered when Sergeant Hoffman's voice cut across the compound. "Barrack C! Rouse! Line up! Hygiene inspection in 5 minutes!" The calm evaporated. Hygiene inspection. It sounded clinical, threatening. Annie's hand instinctively went to her matted hair. This was not a ritual, it was a threat. Panic rippled through the barrack. Hygiene inspection. The words conjured images of cold hoses, chemical powders, and public humiliation. The women instinctively tried to smooth their clothes, to tuck away stray, greasy strands of hair, but it was useless. Their filth was profound, ground into their skin for weeks. "Schnell!" Sergeant Hoffman's voice was sharp. "Outside, now!" They tumbled out into the harsh midday sun, lining up in the dusty compound. Their brief moment of spiritual peace during the hymn felt like a cruel joke. Annie stood straight, her hands clasped tightly behind her back, trying to brace herself. Elsa was trembling beside her, visibly terrified. "Halt den Kopf hoch," Annie murmured. "Hold your head high." A jeep pulled up, and 2 figures emerged. One was Sergeant Hoffman. The other was an American Army nurse, a lieutenant. She carried a metal clipboard and had a look of profound, weary efficiency. She seemed less interested in them as enemies and more as a logistical problem, a potential vector for disease. The nurse, followed by Hoffman, walked down the line. She did not speak. She stopped in front of each woman, looked clinically at her hands, her neck, and, most terrifyingly, her hair. She would gesture, and the woman would have to turn her head, exposing the matted sections behind her ears. Annie watched her approach. She could smell the nurse's faint scent of clean cotton and something antiseptic. It was a smell from another world. When the nurse reached Annie, she paused. Her gaze flickered over Annie's hair. Annie refused to look away, meeting the nurse's tired blue eyes. The nurse made a small tsk sound, not of anger, but of professional frustration. She marked something on her clipboard. Annie felt a wave of shame. It was one thing to live in filth. It was another to have it scrutinized, cataloged, and judged by someone so clinical and clean. She had expected shouting, but this cold, silent assessment was somehow worse. When the nurse had finished the line, she spoke quietly to Sergeant Hoffman. Hoffman nodded and stepped forward. "The lieutenant finds your standard of hygiene unacceptable," Hoffman announced, though her voice lacked any real venom. It was a statement of fact. "Typhus and lice are a threat to the operation of this camp. You will be deloused if this is not corrected." This was the moment they dreaded. Annie squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the sprayers. "However," Hoffman continued, "you will be issued a supplementary ration of soap. You are ordered to use it. Dismissed." A guard at the back began handing out the supplementary ration. Annie held out her hand, a desperate, irrational flicker of hope rising in her. Perhaps this time it would be different. It was not. The object dropped into her palm was familiar. The same dark brown, heavy, caustic bar of lye soap. It was another bar of the same soap that was currently rubbing Elsa's hands raw. It was soap for laundry, for scrubbing floors, for killing germs. Annie closed her hand around the bar. It felt heavy, like a stone. The message was clear. They were not to be clean in the way that nurse was clean. They were to be sanitized. They were a medical problem to be managed, not people deserving of comfort. The lye soap was the standard. She looked at the bar, then at her hair, which felt heavier and dirtier than ever. The hope drained away, leaving a cold, hard residue. The war in Europe had ended. The news arrived not with a bang, but as a slow, creeping certainty that settled over Camp McCain like the humid summer fog. The guards' postures changed. They seemed less tense, but also less interested. The prisoners were no longer active enemies, but relics, a problem to be managed until repatriation. With this new phase came a new routine: re-education. One sweltering evening in June, Annie, Elsa, and the other women from Compound C were marched to the mess hall. The air was sticky, thick with the smell of boiled potatoes and stale coffee. The windows were blacked out. A 16mm projector stood on a table, its lens pointing at a sagging white sheet. Sergeant Hoffman stood at the front. "You will watch this," she said. Her voice was flat, lacking its usual sharp authority. "You will watch, and you will learn what was done in your name." The hall lights clicked off. The projector whirred to life, throwing a flickering, dancing square of light onto the sheet. Annie had been prepared for propaganda. She expected films celebrating American victory, perhaps images of captured German generals signing surrender documents. She was prepared to feel defeated, to feel the sting of nationalism crushed. She was not prepared for this. The film was silent, save for the rhythmic clicking of the projector. It began with shaky, handheld images of British and American soldiers. They were not marching in triumph. They looked sick. Many were covering their faces. Then the camera panned, and Annie's mind simply stopped. It was Belsen. It was Dachau. The images were skeletal. Piles of bodies starved and twisted, bulldozed into open pits like refuse. And the living, hollow-eyed, gaunt figures in striped uniforms staring into the camera with an emptiness that eclipsed all understanding. Annie felt Elsa's hand grip her arm, the nails digging into her skin, but she could not feel the pain. She could not breathe. A low moan began in the room, someone in the back row, but Annie was frozen. This was not war. This was something else. This was a systematic unraveling of humanity. She searched the images for a sign that they were fake, a trick of the camera. But her nurse's training recognized the stark medical reality of starvation, of typhus, of death on an industrial scale. The propaganda she had been fed for years of a clean war, of a righteous cause, dissolved in the harsh, flickering light. She felt a profound physical sickness rise in her throat. This was the Heimat, homeland, she had been fighting to protect. This was the cause her brother had died for. When the lights came back on, no one moved. The silence was absolute, heavier and more suffocating than the heat. Even Sergeant Hoffman looked pale. Annie looked down at her own hands, still stained from kitchen duty. She thought of the lye soap. She had craved something to wash the physical dirt from her hair, but this was a different kind of filth. This was a stain on the soul, and there was no soap in the world that could wash it away. She was German. This was done by her people. She felt Elsa shaking beside her. Annie pulled the girl close, but it was not a gesture of comfort. It was two drowning people clinging to each other in an ocean of shame. The war was over, but the true reckoning had just begun. Work was the only anesthetic. In the days following the film screening, Annie threw herself into the routines of the camp with a desperate, numb focus, peeling potatoes, scrubbing floors, laundering sheets with the abrasive lye soap. She did it all with a mechanical precision. The chatter in the barracks had ceased. The women moved like shadows, their eyes downcast, isolated by a shared, unspoken shame. She was in the main kitchen, a long, hot barrack that suffocated under the smell of boiling potatoes and the greasy signature of frying Spam. Annie was peeling, her hands moving fast and steady, the rhythmic thwack of the knife against the tuber the only sound in her immediate vicinity. Elsa, working at the station beside her, was trembling. Silent tears tracked pathways through the grime on her cheeks, dripping onto the pile of potato skins. She was trying to stifle her sobs, but a choked, gasping sound escaped. Her knife slipped, and the metal tray of peeled potatoes crashed to the concrete floor with a deafening clatter. Every sound in the kitchen stopped. "Was this lost to drüben?" an American sergeant barked from his desk. "Pick it up. No waste." Elsa crumpled, utterly broken, sobbing openly now. Annie immediately dropped her own knife, knelt, and began gathering the scattered potatoes. "Es ist gut, Elsa," she whispered, not daring to look at the sergeant. It was an accident. The sergeant let out an exasperated sigh. "Keller," he called, using Annie's surname. "You're done there. Go to the storeroom, get more sacks. And you," he pointed at Elsa, "go wash your face. I don't want tears in the food." Annie helped Elsa to her feet, nudging her toward the wash basin before heading to the dark storeroom at the back of the kitchen. She was grateful for the reprieve from scrutiny. The storeroom was cooler and dimmer. It took a moment for her eyes to adjust. It smelled different in here. Less of grease, more of burlap, raw coffee beans, and the faint aromatic scent of tobacco from the guards' rations. The sergeant had pointed toward a stack of burlap sacks in the far corner. As Annie moved toward them, she passed a pallet of newly arrived goods, likely Red Cross packages or post-exchange supplies for the American staff. One wooden crate had been pried open, its contents exposed. Amidst boxes of razors, toothpaste, and bars of chocolate, Annie saw them. Glass bottles. They glittered in the dim light from the single overhead bulb. Their labels were colorful, bright blues, pinks, and yellows. She read a word she recognized. Shampoo. Annie froze. Shampoo. She had not seen such a thing in years. Her hand moved reflexively to her own hair. It was stiff, heavy with the grease of the kitchen and weeks of accumulated sweat. She could almost smell it. Not these bottles, but the memory. the scent of lavender from the shampoo her mother used to use on special occasions before the war. It was the scent of cleanliness, of normalcy, of a world where people were not defined by newsreels and judged by their filth. A fleeting, sharp impulse shot through her. Take one. It would be so easy to slip it into the pocket of her apron. But the fear and the shame from the film paralyzed her. She was a prisoner. She was one of the people from Belsen. She did not deserve something so beautiful. She grabbed the burlap sacks, the rough fabric stinging her palms, and turned her back on the glass bottles. But as she walked out of the storeroom and back into the glaring light and the smell of grease, the image of those glittering bottles of shampoo was seared into her mind. It was the symbol of everything she had lost. The weeks blurred into a humid gray monotony. Annie's hands were permanently stained and cracked from the laundry, where the harsh lye soap was her constant companion. The image of the glittering shampoo bottles in the storeroom had faded, dismissed as a mirage, a cruel trick of the light. The shame of the newsreels had settled into a dull, collective ache. They were the enemy. They were the filth. They deserved nothing. It was late afternoon. The air was heavy, promising a thunderstorm. Annie and the others were scrubbing the mess hall floor, moving their brushes in tired, rhythmic strokes. "Compound C, Rouse, in the yard." The voice was Sergeant Hoffman's. It was sharp, unexpected. Work stopped. The women looked at each other, fear flaring instantly. A summons outside of the schedule always meant trouble. A new rule, a punishment, another inspection. They filed out into the dusty compound, the oppressive humidity enveloping them. Sergeant Hoffman stood near the gate, her arms crossed. Beside her stood Corporal Davis, the young guard from the Sunday hymn. He looked awkward and stared at the ground. Between them sat a small wooden shipping crate, similar to the one Annie had seen in the kitchen storeroom. Annie's heart hammered. Was this it? Were they being punished for the stolen glances, the whispered words? "Attention," Hoffman said. Her voice was flat, devoid of emotion. She nodded at Davis. "Open it." Corporal Davis picked up a small crowbar and jammed it under the lid. The sound of nails screeching as they were pulled from the wood set Annie's teeth on edge. He tossed the lid aside. The women collectively held their breath. The crate was full of them. Glass bottles. They were packed in straw, their colorful labels, pinks, blues, and yellows, shockingly bright against the drab brown of the compound. Annie recognized them instantly. It was the shampoo. Silence. No one moved. Annie stared, her mind refusing to process what she was seeing. This had to be a mistake, or worse, a joke. A cruel, elaborate American joke. She imagined opening a bottle and finding it filled with kerosene, or more of the caustic lye soap. The lieutenant from the medical inspection, Hoffman stated, as if reading a report, noted a hygiene deficiency. These supplies have been allocated from the post-exchange surplus to correct it. She gestured to the crate. Each prisoner will take one. Still, no one moved. They stared at the bottles as if they were snakes. Hope was more dangerous than despair. To accept this was to be vulnerable. "Did you not hear me?" Hoffman snapped, her patience breaking. She reached into the crate, grabbed a pink bottle, and shoved it into the hands of Frau Keller, who was closest. Frau Keller flinched, staring at the bottle as if it had burned her. Corporal Davis, avoiding eye contact with any of them, began lifting the bottles out and placing them on the ground. A faint, impossible scent began to cut through the smell of dust and sweat. A chemical, floral perfume. Roses. Hoffman moved down the line. "Keller, Annie, take one." Annie's hand moved slowly, mechanically. Her fingers closed around the cool, smooth glass. It was real. It was heavy. The label was bright pink, adorned with a painting of a woman with impossibly clean, shining hair. She read the words, Rose Formula Shampoo. She looked at the bottle, then at Elsa, who was next in line. Elsa took hers, her hands shaking so violently she almost dropped it. The girl stared at the bottle, and then at Annie, her eyes wide with a terrifying, disbelieving question. Why? Why would the enemy, the victors, the ones who had shown them the depths of their own nation's shame, give them something so human, so gentle? They stood in the wash house, a row of silent women clutching pink and blue glass bottles. The air was thick with disbelief. The guards had not just given them the shampoo. Sergeant Hoffman, in a move of baffling pragmatism, had authorized the use of the hot water boilers for 1 hour. The medical officer insists, she had announced stiffly. It will not work in cold water. Hot water. It was a luxury more profound than the shampoo itself. For 10 minutes, no one moved. They listened to the hiss of the pipes and the gurgle of water filling the basins. It was Elsa who finally broke the silence, her voice a small whisper. Annie, ist es giftig? Is it poison? Annie looked at the girl's terrified face, then at the bright pink bottle in her own hand. Poison. It was a rational fear, a final humiliation. Annie made a decision. She uncapped her bottle. The scent that billowed out was overwhelming. Not the subtle lavender of her memory, but a thick, sweet, chemical wave of roses. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever smelled. No, Annie said, her voice rough. It is not poison. She guided Elsa to a basin, the warm steam rising to meet them. She pumped the lukewarm water over the girl's head. Elsa flinched at the warmth, as if it pained her. Her hair was a solid, greasy mass. Annie poured a small amount of the viscous pink liquid onto her own palm. It felt impossibly smooth, completely alien compared to the gritty, burning lye soap that had defined their existence. She worked the shampoo into Elsa's hair. At first, nothing happened. The grime and oil resisted, the soap refusing to lather. Annie added more water, her fingers massaging, scrubbing, working against the years of filth. And then it happened. A miracle. White, fragrant bubbles began to form. Batcha fong, so much of it that it cascaded down Elsa's neck, thick and white. Annie rinsed, and the water that sluiced into the basin was black. It was the color of mud, of coal dust, of despair. Annie worked the shampoo in a second time. Now, the lather was pure, smelling intensely of roses. Elsa, who had been rigid with tension, suddenly let out a ragged sob. It was not a cry of sadness, but of release. Annie continued to massage her scalp, her own eyes burning. As she rinsed the girl's hair clean, Annie realized she was weeping too. The tears streamed down her own face, mixing with the scented water. "Es ist sauber," Elsa whispered, touching her own hair, feeling the impossible softness. "It is clean." "Ja," Annie replied, "sauber." A dam of restraint broke in the wash house. The other women, watching, began to uncap their own bottles. The room filled with the sounds of running water, quiet weeping, and the explosive competing scents of rose, apple blossom, and pine. They washed their own hair, and then they washed each other's. Frau Keller, her face streaked with tears and suds, scrubbed Annie's scalp with a gentle roughness. When Annie finally rinsed her own hair, the feeling of the water running through clean strands, unimpeded by grease, made her dizzy. The weight was gone. It was not just the weight of dirt, but the weight of the newsreels, the shame, the feeling of being subhuman. Laughter followed the tears, a fragile, rusty sound, as if they were all remembering how to use those muscles. Disbelief remained. Women held up their clean, dripping hair to the light. And then came the quiet, rhythmic sound of combs, precious items they usually used to fight lice, now gliding smoothly through clean, untangled hair. Annie combed out Elsa's hair. It was dark blonde, soft as silk. She felt human. For the first time in years, she truly felt human. The feeling of being clean lasted. It was more than a physical sensation. It was a shield. When Annie woke, she could smell the faint scent of roses on her thin pillow instead of the odor of stale sweat. When she walked across the compound, she held her head higher. She saw the other women doing the same, their movements less like shadows, more like people. They even tied their hair back with scraps of thread, a small, defiant act of vanity. She was assigned to the main laundry, a steam-filled building where she spent 8 hours a day washing the uniforms of the American Guards and the linens from the camp hospital. The work was grueling. The lye soap was still the only soap provided for labor, and it savaged her hands, but she no longer felt defined by it. One afternoon, she was folding a stack of freshly dried linens. Tucked inside one of the sheets, perhaps left by a guard, was a folded copy of the Hattiesburg American, the local Mississippi newspaper. Reading unauthorized materials was strictly forbidden, a violation that could land her in solitary confinement. She glanced around. The steam was thick, and the supervising guard was dozing by the far door. Her hands moved, unfolding the paper. Her English was limited, learned from observation and warning signs, but she understood enough. It was an editorial, a letter to the editor. Her eyes snagged on a word she knew, German. Then another, POWs. She scanned the column, her blood running cold. The writer was irate. They were a citizen whose son was fighting in the Pacific. They demanded to know why their tax dollars were being spent coddling the enemy. The writer complained about the quality of the food given to the prisoners, the cigarettes, the light work. And then Annie saw it. While our boys lack basic supplies, these Nazis at McCain are being handed luxury items. My daughter cannot find shampoo at the store, but we are giving it away, bottles of it, to the very women who supported Hitler's regime. Annie dropped the paper as if it had burned her. The steam from the laundry presses suddenly felt suffocating. The shampoo. It was not a surplus item. It was not a medical necessity. It was a luxury taken from American families and given to them. The shame, which had briefly receded, came rushing back, mingled with a new, sharp fear. The writer saw them as Nazis, as undeserving of basic kindness. She looked at her own clean hair, now a source of guilt. This act of humanity was not a policy. It was a controversy. Keller, she froze. Corporal Davis was standing right behind her. His face was unreadable. He had seen her reading the paper. This was it, the punishment, the end of the brief reprieve. He looked at the newspaper on the floor, then at her. Annie braced herself, her hands gripping the edge of the wooden folding table. Corporal Davis did not shout. He did not call Sergeant Hoffman. He reached into the pocket of his fatigues and pulled out a small, black object. He placed it quietly on the stack of linens she had just folded. It was a comb, a new, clean, black plastic comb. He looked at her, his gaze holding hers for just 1 second. Then he turned and walked out of the laundry, leaving the newspaper on the floor. Annie stared at the comb. He had seen the editorial, too. He knew what people were saying, and instead of punishing her, he had doubled down on his quiet act of defiance. The shampoo had been his choice, and this comb was the punctuation. She realized, with a sudden, aching clarity, that compassion was not free. It had a cost, even for the victors. It was December 24th, 1945. The oppressive heat of the Mississippi summer had been replaced by a penetrating, damp cold that clung to the thin walls of Barracks 09. The war had been over for 7 months. The shock of the newsreels had faded, replaced by a hollow uncertainty. Talk of repatriation filled the compound, a word that tasted of both desperate hope and paralyzing fear. They would be returning to a Germany they did not know, a homeland defined by rubble and shame. Annie had tried to make it Christmas. On the crude wooden table in the center of the room, a small star, painstakingly folded from the tinfoil of a K-ration biscuit, caught the dim light. The barrack smelled of damp canvas and Mississippi pine, a scent Annie now associated with her captivity. Elsa, thinner than ever, sat staring at the door, her shoulders shaking under a rough wool blanket. She had been jumpy all day, the guards' voices outside reminding her that this was not home. "Heimweh?" Annie asked softly. "Homesickness?" Elsa just shook her head, her gaze fixed on the frosted window. Through it, the silhouette of Corporal Davis, pacing his watch, was visible. The door creaked. Corporal Davis stepped inside, ducking his head under the low frame. The blast of cold air that followed him felt sharp, intrusive. Elsa flinched violently, pulling back, a small gasp of terror escaping her. She scrambled behind Annie, expecting a shout, a punishment for their illegal tinfoil star. But Annie did not move. Months ago, this intrusion would have terrified her. Now, she saw the man who had seen her read the editorial, the man who had silently left the black comb. She saw the soldier who had, with profound awkwardness, unloaded the crate of rose-scented shampoo. Annie clutched the younger girl, pressing Elsa's face into her coat. "Es ist gut, Elsa. See," she whispered, her voice firm and calm. "It is good, Elsa. Look." The corporal was not looking at them. His gaze was fixed on the table, on the pathetic, handmade star. He seemed intensely uncomfortable, his rifle slung low, his presence filling their small space. He fumbled in the large pocket of his coat. He pulled out 3 small, brightly wrapped objects and placed them gently on the table, next to the star. They were bars of soap. Not the harsh brown lye soap of the laundry, and not the floral shampoo of the summer. These were wrapped in red and green paper, smelling faintly of pine and cinnamon. Christmas soap. Annie stared at the gift. When the shampoo had arrived, it had been a shock, a mystery that brought tears of disbelief and confusion. This time, there was no confusion. This was not a medical order. This was not a surplus item from an angry editorial. This was a gift, a clear and conscious violation of the non-fraternization rule still posted on the compound gate. He did not speak. He just nodded once, curtly, his gaze averted, and backed out of the barrack, closing the door quietly against the cold. Elsa slowly peeked out from behind Annie. She crept forward, touching one of the bars as if it might vanish. Annie watched her. The shampoo had been a resurrection. It had washed away the filth and reminded them they were human. But this soap, this simple, illicit gift, was something else. It was reconciliation. Later that night, long after Elsa was asleep, Annie reached under her thin mattress. Her fingers found the cool, smooth glass of the empty pink bottle. She had kept it, cleaning it carefully. It was her only possession. She held it up to the sliver of moonlight coming through the window. It was a reminder, not of the war, but of the moment the war inside her had begun to end. She would take this bottle home. It was her proof that compassion could exist in the most impossible of places, an artifact of an enemy who had taught her how to be human again.